Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Writing Center October workshop. We're trying to get in the habit of doing one workshop a month for you, where we're trying to rotate the topics. So last month we did the professor panel where we interviewed some professors about what they wanted students to know about writing. Southern Productions is professionally handling the recording of that. So we're waiting to get that back from them. And once we do, we will put that on our YouTube channel. So if you've been waiting for that recording, that is coming. We apologize, it's not there yet. But this one we have here and it will be up on our YouTube channel right away as well. And then we'll have one more in November. Monday, November 7th is going to be our last workshop. And whereas this one is focused on content and research, that one will be focused on revision and editing. So we'll try to balance the themes and then we'll have new topics for you in the spring as well. But I just want to point it out there that if anyone has any topics they'd like to see us cover in a workshop, please feel free to email us because we want to make sure it's useful and helpful for everybody involved. Sorry about the waiting room binging noise. I apologize. I may have to mute that if that's a problem too. But so my name is Alicia Byler. I'm the coordinator of the Writing Center. It's great to meet you if I haven't already. And today's workshop is going to be led by one of our team members, Katie Frankel. She is a PhD student at the University of Cincinnati in rhetoric and composition, and she has worked with the Writing Center since 2019. And she also teaches some of our English 101 classes here on campus. So she's got a wealth of wisdom when it comes to research papers and writing. So I'm going to turn things over to her, and then she'll have some time for questions. So folks online, feel free to communicate through the chat as well. And then we've got people in person too. So welcome everybody.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you everybody for coming. We are really excited that we have more than just Alicia and myself. So thanks for coming today. Okay, so kind of the gist of this workshop is just kind of broadly to cover how to integrate source material into academic essays. And so for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about why and when to include source material, how to balance source material with your own voice, and also the difference between summarizing and paraphrasing and directly quoting. So as you can see, we'll have time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions in the meantime, definitely feel free to ask and we can stop and talk about that. Okay, so part one is why include source material. So there are three main reasons that you can include source material in an academic essay, and that is to establish ethos, so your credibility as an author, because carefully choosing your source material will help your own credibility. And also source material, of course, can be used to provide evidence and to provide both evidence and context for some of the claims that you're making, not just if you're making an argument, but just to help guide your reader along and kind of immerse them in the literature that you're already aware of. And then lastly, leading from that, including source material will help you add your own voice to scholarship. So by including relevant literature, you can show your readers where and how your own research is filling a gap in scholarship. So on building credibility, Lumen Learning, which is they create course materials for higher education. They claim that they explain that incorporating source material and essays can be helpful as you develop your own ethos, because by integrating by integrating the credibility of others into your own writing, it will strengthen your writing and, like I said, build your own ethos as an author. So you're using someone else's credibility to in turn build your own credibility in your essay. So here are some examples of what that would look like. This first example was taken from a position paper from a master's student here that was a really well done position paper that we have permission to use for the Writing Center. So his topic was sanctification. And one of his lines as he builds context was that David Allen notes, quote, "What one believes about this subject has serious ramifications for both theology and praxis." And then I have included the footnote as well, so you can just see that that's an academic source he's drawing from. And so then on the contrary, if this writer had said essentially the same thing, but without integrating the source material, that could have looked like some people think that atonement is crucial to a church's theology, or even just atonement is crucial to a church's theology. there's nothing wrong necessarily with either of those statements, but you can see that by drawing from the Allen source, you can just see to the title of the text is The Extent of the Atonement. It's an academic source we know from the B&H academic. You can tell that that author has done his research and included a credible source. So especially for students writing papers, you know, we're all learning, and by drawing from the experts in the fields, you can build your own ethos in that way. Okay, also, as I said, including source material will help as you provide evidence. And a lot of people aren't entirely sure when and how and why to provide evidence and how often they need to. But there are two occasions that I think of that I advise students on that usually necessitate adding source material. And those are for building context and making claims. So here's an example, again, from a master's position paper here. This author is building context, and in this example, the writer is arguing in support of the Reformed portrayal of sanctification. So as he is building up the context, he provides a few kind of a literature review, almost some background information on a few different evangelical perspectives. You can see in this example that he is drawing from the—
You left saving the middle of it. Except you have no.
Should I mute that? Okay. Just a moment. All the participants. Okay, sorry about that. So you can see in this example, I know it's kind of hard to read up there, but this writer is showing context for how prominent Christian perspectives take up sanctification. And this is just one page of that section. You can see that he draws from 4 different sources. Again, I know it's kind of hard to see. I'll step back here, but he draws from the Lutheran View source, Living by Faith, Letter on Romans, and again from the Lutheran View. So even if you haven't read any of these sources, which the readers likely haven't, you can just tell from looking at the footnotes that they are all credible sources. We can assume that they're all peer-reviewed sources. So the author's building his credibility, but he's also using the source material to provide context. So especially doing something like comparing a couple of different perspectives on something when readers probably aren't super familiar with that subject matter, drawing from sources can be helpful because it shows it kind of essentially gives a miniature literature review. And by that, it just draws from a few different sources to explain a concept that the reader might not be familiar with. Here's another brief example of a writer who was giving context and background information on different canonical models. You can see here that I didn't include the footnotes here, but this writer draws from 2 different sources as he is establishing some context. You can see that he's talking about different frameworks and different categories. So the footnote is there. And also for practical reasons, the footnote is really there too, so that if readers are interested in a and they want to learn more, they can go to that source. So I know for the papers that we write, either in undergrad or in grad school, we probably won't be reading all of the sources that somebody includes, but one purpose of integrating sources is so that your reader could go to that source if they wanted to learn more. So a little bit more on building context. Using source material while you're building context shows your readers that you're well educated and informed on the subject matter that you're writing about. So your source material will also provide evidence of the context and background information you're developing. And then again, be used to review what current scholarship is circulating regarding your topic. So here's kind of an application tip. In your own writing, you can review when and where you're building context and ask yourself, why should I incorporate source material when building this context? And the other primary example I gave for places that most authors will use source material is when making claims. So while major claims made in graduate level papers are often developed over multiple pages with adequate evidence incorporated, minor claims usually need evidence as well. So here's an example from one of those papers where I took just a minor claim that the author has made, and this is not his primary argument in the paper, but he says, lastly, not all who claim to be part of the church are actually part of it. Many claim the name of Jesus without being real followers. So again, those sentences are completely fine on their own, but he's making a claim that a lot of people claim to be Christians and they're really not. And so somebody might ask, well, why? How do you know that? So he provides a lot of scriptural citations there. Okay, so here's an example of a paragraph that I used in my English 101 class I was teaching the other day. So we are kind of in our argument unit. We're in our argument unit right now, so they're writing argument papers. And we looked at one example that was really well written, but this one paragraph kind of gave me a little bit of pause. And you can see that it says the paper was over college students' use of credit cards. So it says, often students discover too late that they are thoroughly hooked. The results can be catastrophic. Some students are forced to drop out of school and take low-paying full-time jobs. Others, once they graduate, have difficulty landing good jobs because of their poor credit rating. Many students suffer psychologically as well. Even those who have parents willingly to bail them out of debt often experience a great deal of anxiety and guilt. 2 students recently grew so stressed by their accumulating debt that they committed suicide. So we can see here with this last sentence, they provide a source, and that's great. But I thought that this paragraph makes a lot of big claims about how there are a lot of students suffering psychologically, and they have difficulty finding good jobs, and that their parents are having to help them. So to me, those were some big claims to make without any evidence to back it up. And out of this whole example paper, actually, which I found online for first-year college writers, this was the only paragraph that I felt was really underdeveloped. So I used it as an example to explain to my students why you need to continuously have that evidence to back your claims, even if it's not a primary claim that you're making. So lastly, contributing to scholarship is one benefit of integrating source material. So even if your essay never lives beyond the classroom, and by that I mean, even if you write an essay for a classroom and then you never do anything with it for the rest of your life, but especially if you want to publish, whether you want to publish that essay or an essay that you're going to write in the future, incorporating adequate and credible sources into your essays will prove to your readers. So I have the S in parentheses because, again, that might just be your professor, but it might be a wider audience. It will prove to your readers that you're making a unique contribution to scholarship and that you're responsibly well-read on your subject matter. So it's difficult to write a strong paper without strong sources and without enough sources to support your stance. Even for the very reason that, again, you're wanting to make a nuanced contribution to scholarship. So if you haven't done the reading and you don't know what's out there, you can't really be sure where to add your own. And I'm just going to check the chat here. Okay. Everything. Okay, so does anybody have questions on any of that so far? Okay, so moving into part 2 of the presentation, this is kind of the crux of the workshop, but again, the other parts kind of build on it and follow it. So balancing source material with your own voice. Incorporating source material into your own writing can sometimes feel like a balancing act. That's why we have that's why Alicia named this workshop the balancing act, I think. And because you want your ideas and your claims to be supported with evidence, but you don't want your evidence to dominate your own voice. And a lot of writers are just not really sure how to balance that out. So just starting before we even launch into that, the purposes of voice in an essay, you will use your own voice to make your unique connections between scholarship, to challenge ideas and present your own ideas, and then of course to advance your argument and develop your thesis throughout the essay. So if you have a lot of sources and you're just essentially summarizing the sources, your voice is kind of lost because you're not analyzing and you're not doing much with the sources. So a lot of people will ask, how much evidence should I include? And there's not really a hard and fast answer to this, but a general rule of thumb is, on average, if you have a 10-page paper, you should have at least about 10 sources. So about a one paper to one source ratio, but of course that could be more. And also for undergraduate essays, that might sometimes be less. Okay, I know this is a big slide, so I apologize, but I thought this was a really helpful quote to include. So one factor that can affect the amount of sources you include in your paper might be the amount of core versus peripheral sources that you're using. So Martin Booker is a sociology professor, and he kind of summed this up really well, comparing core to peripheral sources. So he argues that this distinction between the two sources is important for how you count your number of readings. Core readings can count fully, peripheral readings not quite so much. This can become a problem if your bibliography is overly weighted toward peripheral readings. So he says that if you have, 10 readings in your bibliography, but only 1 or 2 are on the core of the topic, then that would be insufficient. So despite the relatively high number of readings that bibliography had, if not very many are on the core of your topic, then you probably don't have enough sources to really support you there. So he gives the example of globalization on Japanese culture. So if only 1 or 2 core readings are in that bibliography and the other 10 are just what he calls peripheral readings that just provide examples and additional material, then the core might be a little bit hollow and it just might not have enough substance. So does that make sense? So you have your core readings that really focus on the crux of the topic, and then peripheral readings kind of give additional resources. Okay, I know these are really hard to see, but this was just a real example I took from some papers we use at the Writing Center. So this master's paper was 11 pages long and it has 15 sources. I would say that's pretty average. And then this doctoral paper was 19 pages and had 33 sources. And so again, you can this isn't always true, but generally when you move from undergraduate to master's to doctoral, as a writer becomes more well-read and really knows what scholarship is out there, they'll include more sources in their essays. So that's pretty standard. Okay, and so actually there's just one other thing I wanted to look at on this slide. And again, I know it's kind of hard to see, but this master's paper, the example was the paper was on sanctification. So even if you just look at the source titles, you can see sanctification, again, the entire sanctification, and you can kind of just look at those keywords that are evident throughout the sources. And then that was the example we looked at where the author provided the Lutheran perspective on sanctification. So you can see where his peripheral sources are helping to build context, but you can see that sanctification's keyword is pretty present throughout the bibliography. Okay, so keeping balance. While different parts of the paper will need more source material than others, throughout your entire paper, you should still be able to try to keep a balance between your own voice and the source material. So I always tell people that your evidence should support your voice, not the other way around. So you're not just writing a book review or writing an article review. You're not supporting the author's voice. The source is supporting your voice. So your source material shouldn't dominate your voice in an academic essay, really, even if you're in a literature review section. Of course, in something like a literature review, you would have a lot of source material because you're reviewing it, but your own voice should still be at the forefront as you make connections. So again, I know a little bit hard to see, I apologize for that. But there's just a subheading up there. And this writer is using both scriptural evidence and scholarly sources, but you can see that the writer's own voice is still dominant and consistent as he makes connections and analyzes. So throughout just these few paragraphs, his own voice is still at the forefront, even though you can see that he's engaging a lot with scripture. And I will just read the first few sentences of each paragraph. So this first paragraph is our Lord Jesus testified about his mission during his time on earth. I think that is why, yes, explaining why he came. Many of his statements are of general nature related to his ministry and so on. So this writer is kind of bringing different ideas together. It's still his voice, even though he's quoting scripture a lot. And then even down in the second paragraph, when he has the direct quotes from the Wayne Grudem source, the writer is still making his own connections. And again, the source material is supporting the writer. The writer isn't supporting the source material. Okay, so our last part is the difference between summarizing and paraphrasing and directly quoting, and how you'll use each of these when you're writing an academic essay. So summarizing is usually done to build context and to review scholarship. Of course, here at the seminary, we summarize scripture. Paraphrasing is used to refer to a specific source or idea, but the writer of the academic essay is using his or her own words when paraphrasing, instead of using the author of the source, instead of using their exact wording, because using the exact wording may not be necessary if the writer is able to paraphrase. And then lastly, directly quoting, of course, is used to help illustrate specific ideas without at all changing the author's original intention. So the Purdue OWL, which is a reliable source in and of itself, kind of further breaks this down. Quotations are identical to the original. Paraphrasing involves putting a passage from source material again into your own words, and we'll refer to that specific source. So if you're reviewing a sample paper like we have online at the Writing Center and you see the footnotes, you can of course then look at the footnotes and see where that paraphrase is directing you to. And then summarizing, again, used when the writer puts a main idea into their own words, usually just including the main points. Okay, so this is kind of a dramatic example, it might seem like, but I have seen some papers that do this, so I wanted to show it. So one important tip is to avoid overquoting. So I won't read this, but you can see here, this is not anyone's writing that I took. I just made this on my own as an example. So you can see that the writer introduces the source, whoops, Lisa Arnold, and then has this big quote here. And then there's this connecting sentence. Composition pedagogy tends to focus on the English speaking classroom, and then again, another big quote. So I know that seems a bit dramatic, but I see it a lot. So you can think, how could this paragraph be strengthened? And if this was an actual paragraph that somebody submitted to the Writing Center, they might be advised how they could paraphrase instead of directly quoting, and also consider, why could they paraphrase instead of directly quoting? And it again goes back to that balancing act, because there's so much direct quoting here that the author's own voice is really drowned out. Okay, so here's just a practical tip on that note. I just call this the highlighting method. It is what it sounds like. You can just go in on Word, or you can print off your essay and highlight anytime you directly quote. So here is an example from one of those master's position papers. Just a few direct quotes. So even though there are 3 direct quotes in one paragraph, I don't think that the balance is too heavy on the quote side, because the author's voice is still at the forefront. And again, you can just use this tip if you're worried, if you're over quoting. And the next step, if you were to do this, the next step could be to think, how could I paraphrase or summarize instead of directly quoting this source? So a strong paper will use a blend of summary, paraphrase, and direct quoting. And I show that on the next slide. So here's another application tip. In your own writing, you can consider where you summarize, paraphrase, and quote. So you can notice some trends in your own writing, such as if you include numerous block quotes or if you have really long summary paragraphs. And that's really helpful. It's helpful to be aware of your own trends in your writing, especially during the revision process. So here's an example of that. This paper is from Tori Tier, who is, some of you might know him. He is a great writer, and he gave me one of his papers to use for this presentation. But I've kind of broken this up by highlighting the purple is Tori's claim and his voice as he's drawing together some different scholarship. So the green highlighted, the text that's highlighted in green is a paraphrase. You can see that he links to that source directly. And then of course the blue is the direct quote. And then down below, the yellow is where he summarizes some scripture. So he uses a really good blend of summarizing and paraphrasing and directly quoting. And you certainly don't have to, have it 33% for each one, have it exactly even throughout the essay, but you shouldn't just mainly be, like 90% paraphrasing or of course directly quoting. You should try to use all three. Okay, so then all of that being said, I know that that was a lot, some takeaways and some next steps for how to apply this information. So first, I would advise people to just read. Like I said, if you know you're going to be writing a topic on sanctification, just, start reading and start researching. I always recommend that writers start reading before they start writing so that they can be aware of what other people are saying about a subject. So again, try to find and identify some of those core sources. So sources that are covering the same topic that you are going to cover in your writing, because also the more that you've read before you begin writing, the easier it will usually be to know when and how and why to integrate source material. And then after you've read and after you've started drafting, I encourage writers to start reviewing each section of the draft. So you could break this down section by section or paragraph by paragraph, and consider whether your context and claims are substantiated with source material. So you can ask yourself, are there any sections of the draft that are really lacking evidence? And also one tip that I give to writers is to try to anticipate where your readers might ask questions and want evidence. And I do this a lot in my own writing because, when we're writing an argument paper, there are so many sub-arguments and sub-claims we have throughout the essay. But if you're reading through your essay and you ever think someone might want proof of that, then that's probably a good indicator to add a source. Okay, and then the last two steps are to identify and interrogate. So after you've read and reviewed your draft, then stay in your draft and identify where you already engage with source material. So whether that's summarizing or paraphrasing or directly quoting, and then consider how you're balancing that blend. So again, you could use the highlighting method or, brackets or underline where you do each one. And you don't necessarily have to parse out how you use different sources in every essay you write, but it can be helpful a time or two just to be aware of any trends that you have as a writer. Sometimes when I review my own essays, I'm not aware that I've used 5 block quotes. And so then I'll go in and change that a little bit. And lastly, I call this interrogate. So after you've identified where you're using source material, you can just kind of interrogate why you're using the source material and what the source material is doing and how it's working and how the source material is supporting your own ideas and argument. So this is relevant at any level of writing, but especially for first and second year writers, when they're kind of just getting used to researching and using source material. And I certainly did this when I was in undergrad, but some writers will use source material that's not really doing a lot and it's not really supporting a point. So don't use source material just because you need, 10 required sources. So each source should really be intentionally working in your draft and advancing your thoughts, helping you make those connections. So if you have a source that you're not really engaging with, you can sometimes just omit that one. Okay, so that was kind of the conclusion of that presentation. And I do want to draw attention to the Writing Center if you're not already aware. So the Writing Center is a free service here for both undergrad and grad students. And the physical location is in Norton 114. And you can make an appointment over Zoom or in person. And you can also sometimes just drop in. So the fall hours are posted on the website Monday through Friday, various times. And you can also email the Writing Center if none of those times work for you. And then one really great service that the Writing Center offers is just to submit your draft online. And so if you were to submit your draft and you wanted help with something like how you're using source material, I couldn't include the full form on here, but there's a section for you to explain what you'd like help with. And then somebody can email you back and leave you some comments on your draft based on that. And then also, if you ever just have questions, if you ever, aren't sure how to cite a source or, would like help with how to smoothly integrate a source, you can always just email the Writing Center in question and someone will get back to you. Okay, and then lastly, we have a really great collection of resources. The website is sbtswriting.squarespace.com. I've kind of included a little screenshot there. It has this citation quick guide and how to cite the Bible, some book review examples, some sample theology paper, just a lot of different resources on this website that will help you, again, whether you're an undergrad or a grad student. So I think that's about it. Does anybody in person or on Zoom have any questions? Yes.
Just going back to the ratio of core readings and peripheral readings, what would you suggest in terms of how many core readings should we have for
Yeah, that's a great question. So people on Zoom who may not have been able to hear, someone asked what the ratio to core versus peripheral readings you should have in an essay. And again, there's not really a hard and fast rule, but I would say just off the top of my head, maybe about a 60% to 40% ratio. So the majority of your sources should be on your primary topic, but then you should also have quite a few sources that are helping to build context and give examples. So, someone might argue that that ratio is a little bit off. It'll probably look different for each paper, but I would say just like a good chunk of your sources should be on the core topic. Any other questions?
Because sometimes I think it's not intentionally to plagiarism, but sometimes it's kind of like I guess the percentage of it from using sources and
Yeah, that's also a great question. So someone else's question was about avoiding plagiarism and how many sources to use compared to your own writing. So also, if anybody ever has any questions about plagiarism, that's another thing that the Writing Center can help with if you'd ever like a Zoom appointment or just to email some questions. But so essentially, if you were to follow the 1-to-1 ratio of one source per page, then you can kind of assume from that maybe like 25% of each page would be engaging with source material. Again, if you just followed the 1-to-1 ratio. And of course, that will look different for different papers. But so again, I'm sorry that there's not an exact answer, but just if you follow the general guideline that as you make your argument and make connections, you are really presenting your own ideas and the sources are in the background and your own voice is at the forefront, then I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer. But again, your voice will dominate over the entirety of the essay and the sources will just back you up. So also, if there's a really complex topic, you might need some extra sources, or if it's a topic that most people already know, you might need fewer sources. But definitely, if anybody ever has any questions about plagiarism, you can just send your draft to the Writing Center and we can help you with that. And I think there's something in the chat. Okay, so this question here, do you have any tips on source interaction in your own voice once you have cited and included the proper evidence through quote and summary? So I do have a few tips on that. And one, and I know that this can be hard when you have a lot of sources you're including, but one way I think for writers to really engage with source material and form their own opinions is to really have a solid understanding of the source that they're engaging with. So I know if you have a lot of sources, it can be easy to just want to skim through, and sometimes that is okay. But let me make sure I'm understanding this person's question well. But really intentionally read through that source and really annotate and try to understand the source so that you know how to add your own voice to that. Did that answer your question, Austin? Okay, great. Yeah, so that would be my main tip, is to just really try to, again, it's about being a responsible researcher, to really engage and try to understand that text. And then once you really know what the text is saying, you can add your own voice and again, use it to support your own argument. Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Just thinking through the process of writing a research paper. That thesis is one of like the first things that it's important, like you said, to read before we start a research paper. So hopefully our thesis is informed by what we've read. But as we're writing and reading more, I don't know, this is never, I'm just curious, like, what would you say to somebody who might not agree with their thesis like halfway through their paper or something like that, or they're like trying to support something that they know has holes in it that they didn't know had holes in it when they started the paper?
Yeah, that is a really excellent question. Yeah, so the question was, what do you do if you have a thesis, but then halfway through your paper, you realize that the source material is proving that your thesis is maybe not correct and has some holes in it? And this excites me because I think of research and writing as a process of inquiry. So it's really kind of a pursuit of knowledge. You're not just making an argument, but you're really growing as a scholar. And so I think it's actually great when that happens. I know not everybody would agree with me because it might make some more work on your end, but I always tell writers that, you know, your thesis can change. So you can start out with a working thesis, but then after you've read 5 or 10 sources, you're realizing that your thesis needs to change and you need to make a different argument. And so I think that that's great when that happens, and that's totally okay. Some writers will just get, you know, a little discouraged and think they have to start over because they're writing a new paper with a new thesis, but you really don't. So you can start with a working thesis, and as you read, if the reading informs you enough to change your thesis and change your opinion, then that is actually a good thing, because you can have a strong thesis that is really supported by the evidence. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, are there any last questions? Okay, so this question is, how do I write the argumentative paper? This is my first time. I don't know what to do. So for that question, I would definitely first advise that you meet with your professor, because writing an argumentative paper will look different for, you know, first-year writing class versus, you know, a class at the graduate level. But some general tips that I give writers for getting started are, I actually have my writers, you know, say that this is for like a first year writing class. I have my writers just do some free writing and just write about some of their passions and interests and some of their convictions about various things. And then when you write an argumentative paper, again, you're going to be doing a lot of reading to engage with the source material. So think about what you genuinely want to know more about. So if you have an argument you want to make and you think you could make it in 5 minutes and you really don't need to read anything else, and that's probably not the best argument to be making. So think about what you're interested in and what convictions you have, and even just what topics you're interested in. And then my advice would just be to start reading and just start poking around in the literature, even just looking at some online web sources, and then develop a working thesis that you think you might use. So your working argument that you think you can make based on the literature you've reviewed, and then go from there. But this process will look different in different classes. So to the student who asked that question, that's a great question. And I definitely recommend that you email your professor and ask for some guidance on walking through that process. Okay, any last minute questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you to everybody on Zoom who asked questions. I think we had a great turnout. And again, if you have any questions about this presentation, or you think of any questions for something you're already writing or something you'll need to write later in the semester, definitely reach out to the Writing Center. You can just send them an email or set up an appointment. So thank you, everybody.